We now come to the general debate on LGBT plus History Month. I call the Minister to move, Minister Mia Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, for most people under the age of 40, it's almost inconceivable to imagine a society in which LGBT plus people were not visible and integrated. Most, if not all of us, have LGBT plus family, friends and colleagues. In this very chamber, 1 in 10 members identify as LGBT plus, a world record for any parliament as far as we know. And yet it was not long ago that LGBT plus people were either invisible or villainised. If an LGBT plus person was hospitalised, their partner was not recognised as next of kin. Trans people on TV were confined to clichés and offensive stereotypes. And if you were to believe the papers, LGBT plus people were deviants to be feared. That British society is now a largely welcoming place for LGBT plus people is due to the tireless and patient efforts of countless individuals and groups, from the early efforts of campaigners in the 1950s, quietly seeking the recommendations of Lord Wolfenden and see them made into law, to the loud protests against Section 28 in the 1980s and the moving fight for marriage equality in the 2010s. These people have not only driven change, they've enriched our society. The Stonewall riots in America were a landmark moment in the global fight for LGBT plus equality. From then on, unapologetic visibility and authenticity would be the banner under which LGBT plus people would organise. These lessons were learned and adapted to life here in the UK, where we have our own history of struggle for LGBT plus equality. Our first Pride March was held in 1972, when a few hundred brave souls wound their way from Hyde Park to Trafalgar Square. The trepidation of these individuals that they must have experienced is today perhaps hard for many of us to imagine. And yet alongside this trepidation, there must have also been a strong sense of action, achievement and community. It's undoubtedly that sense of community that played a part in one of the more colourful moments in our history. 37 years ago, in this very building, in an inverse of its reigning men, a number of lesbians abseiled their way from the public gallery and onto the benches of the other place, in a protest at the passing of Section 28. And back in Wales, in the area my family is from, in the traditional mining communities of the Leith, Swansea and Delice valleys, during the miners' strike of 1984, those traditional communities were perhaps somewhat bemused to be supported financially and morally by lesbians and gays support the miners. They in turn were repaid by the legendary friendship and loyalty of many of those in mining communities when in 1985 the miners showed their support by joining the Pride marches in Cardiff and London.
Well, my honourable friend, give way.
Indeed I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and her incredible speech, and I thank her for her commitment to this house as well. And I know my honourable friend's journey when she was a teacher. Does my honourable friend agree with me that it's important that allies stick together and we fight for other people's rights as well as our own if we're truly going to move forward with recognising and appreciating people and allowing them to be their authentic selves?
Well, she is absolutely right. In the fight for rights, it is absolutely right that we stick together, and I know that she has done fantastic work as a fantastic ally of the LGBT plus community. Now, I'm proud to say that the history of the LGBT plus rights in this country is intertwined with the history of Labour in government. It was a Labour government that decriminalised homosexuality in 1967. It was a Labour government that equalised the age of consent in 2000 and repealed the hateful Section 28 in 2003. A Labour government lifted the ban on LGBT plus people serving in the armed forces, created the Gender Recognition Act, pioneered civil partnerships, introduced laws to allow unmarried couples, including same-sex couples, to apply for adoption, and laid down the landmark Equality Act. With each milestone, a consensus emerged across the political spectrum, a consensus that LGBT plus people deserve protection, recognition and opportunity. LGBT plus people were finally viewed as just that. Even the Conservative Party, long opposed to much of what I just outlined, began to change its view. It was, after all, a Conservative Prime Minister in coalition with the Liberal Democrats who introduced same-sex marriage into law, albeit heavily dependent on Labour votes. On this point, I would like to give a special thanks to Baroness Featherstone, the then Liberal Democrat Equalities Minister, who pushed through the Same-Sex Marriage Act with tireless effort. And yet, in recent years, that consensus has begun to fray. Increasingly, voices in society and in this chamber are pushing division, anxiety and apprehension. Whilst the tone of debate on LGBT+ rights has always been contentious, the level of toxicity has perhaps never been so intense. Our answer to this must be to lead by example and conduct ourselves in measured, considered and respectful language. It's vital that we, regardless of party or position, promote a tone and quality of debate that, whilst at times may provoke impassioned disagreement, refuses to lower itself to the politics of division and anxiety. Madam Deputy Speaker, for decades, Labour in government has sought to advance the rights, protections and opportunities of LGBT+ people, and this government is no different. Take, for example, conversion practices. We know their abuse. They do not work and they leave a legacy of painful memories and lasting mental health problems. The previous government did nothing to ban this abhorrent practice. This government will be different. That's why we've committed to publish draft legislation in the King's Speech detailing our plan to introduce a fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. Of course, whilst it's important that we protect people from these abusive practices, the government has been clear that any ban must not cover legitimate psychological support, treatment or non-directive counselling. It must also respect the important role that teachers, religious leaders, parents and carers can have in supporting those exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. In our manifesto, we also committed to modernising, simplifying and reforming gender recognition law whilst upholding the Equality Act and its provisions on single-sex exceptions. We will remove indignities for trans people who deserve support and acceptance, whilst retaining the need for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from a specialist doctor. We will set out our next steps on this work in due course. I also want to touch on the important work this government is undertaking around sexual health. Everyone in this House today is aware of the terrible toll that HIV and AIDS took upon the LGBT+ community during the 1980s and 90s. During this time, thousands of young gay and bisexual men and trans people lost their lives. Since then, attitudes have changed through the work of so many courageous individuals. Many of us remember the courage of the then MP for Islington and South Finsbury, Chris, now Lord Smith, already the first openly gay MP. Then in 2005, he announced his HIV positive status, becoming the first member of this House to acknowledge their diagnosis. As set out in our manifesto, HIV is a key priority for the government, and we have commissioned a new plan to end HIV transmissions within England by 2030. We have shown our commitment to this. Just this week, the Prime Minister showed us all how easy and quick an HIV test can be. And back in November, the Prime Minister confirmed £27 million of additional funding to expand the highly successful NHS Emergency Department opt-out HIV testing programme. In regard to opt-out testing, we know this works well and is able to reach those who are less likely to engage with sexual health services. During the last 27 months, over 2 million HIV tests have been conducted through the programme. Indicatively, indeed I will.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I wasn't going to intervene on this point, but it reminded me of my Uncle Stephen, who sadly passed away in the 90s following a positive HIV diagnosis, and I wanted to have the opportunity to mention him in this place. And would the Would the Minister agree with me that it's so important that we end the stigma around HIV to support all people, so actually people like my Uncle Stephen don't need to have their life end prematurely?
Yeah. Well, I thank my honourable friend for mentioning a very, very personal experience of the terrible losses that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s, and he is absolutely right that from those very first moments when we were perhaps fearful to be the first person to wear the red ribbon on the 1st of December, now hopefully we can combat that stigma, but we know there's still a lot to do worldwide in order to combat stigma and ensure that people get the treatments that are available. So, last week I had the privilege to visit Fast Track Cymru in Cardiff and hear about the innovative work that they are doing to eradicate the transmission of HIV, including the test and post service that is now available in Wales. Before I move on to issues relating to trans and gender questioning youth, I'm sure I don't need to remind members of my earlier words urging measured, considered and respectful debate. I'm pleased to confirm that NHS England has opened 3 children and young people's gender services in the North West, in London and in Bristol. These services operate under an innovative model and embed multidisciplinary teams in specialist children's hospitals. These services have begun seeing patients from the national waiting list. A 4th service will open in the east of England in the spring. NHS England remains on schedule to deliver a gender clinic in each region of England by 2026. In regard to puberty blockers, I am aware of the views of many on this subject and how sensitive this can be. In March last year, NHS England took the decision not to commission the routine use of puberty blockers for the treatment of gender incongruence, informed by an evidence review conducted by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. These findings were echoed in the CAS review and accompanying systematic reviews conducted by the University of York, which found insufficient evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty blockers for adolescents. There is a clear time for this order to be reviewed in 2027. Better quality evidence is critical if the NHS is to provide reliable, transparent information and advice to support children and young people and their parents and carers in making potentially life-changing decisions. That's why we're supporting NHS England to set up a study into the impacts of puberty-suppressing hormones as a treatment option for children and young people with gender incongruence. The trial aims to begin recruiting participants in spring 2025. Turning to education, as many of you are aware, before venturing into politics, I was by profession a comprehensive school teacher. But back in the 80s, Section 28, introduced into law by the then Conservative government, banned the promotion of homosexuality or the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. In the classroom, if a pupil was verbally being hateful or discriminatory towards one of their peers, I did not want it to go unchallenged, but found myself just telling them not to use such language or risk upsetting someone. Anything more explicit could potentially be promoting homosexuality and breaking the law and risk me losing my job. I did not protect those pupils who were the object of such comments in the way that they should have been protected. I should have done more. Today, the notion that an LGBT plus family is pretend is absurd to most. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to find same-sex parents picking up their children from school.
Give way.
Indeed, I'll give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I appreciate the Minister's apology, but to have taken such a stance would have meant that she would have lost her job. And I think, although we can always reflect and always do better in hindsight, we have to be kind to ourselves and give ourselves the space to be able to see that grace in ourselves as well.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her very kind comments on the issue. But even today, it does not mean that there are no challenges. Coming out, particularly to family or classmates, is still challenging and scary, with all the worry of how that might be perceived and the fear of bullying. In 2018, the previous government introduced LGBT plus people into the RSHE curriculum. The reality of diverse family types would, in stark contrast to Section 28, be taught as a fact of life in modern Britain. Mr. Speaker, as the House is aware, the RSHE and gender questioning pupil guidance is currently under review, and the government is engaging with stakeholders, including parents, teachers and pupils. The government is also drawing from the available evidence, including the CAS review, to finalise the guidance. As the Education Secretary said in her first month in office, children's well-being must be at the heart of any decisions on the RSHE and gender questioning guidance. Another area I wish to touch on today is the LGBT plus veterans and personnel in the armed forces. In 2021, Falklands veteran Major General Alistair Bruce married his husband in full military regalia and was celebrated in regional and national media. Yet when he joined the army in 1979, it was illegal to be both LGBT+ and a member of our armed forces. As a result, the General was forced to hide part of himself for decades just to be afforded the right to serve his country. It was not until 2000 that this harmful policy was rectified so that ability and not identity determines if one is able to serve their country. In 2023, Lord Etherton delivered the results and recommendations of his independent review into the period of the ban on LGBT+ personnel. And just this week, at an event to mark 25 years since the lifting of the ban, I heard some of the harrowing stories of those affected by that ban. This government is committed to delivering in full the recommendations of Lord Etherton's review. Only last month, the winning design for a new LGBT+ memorial for Armed Forces personnel was unveiled, soon to be housed at the National Arboretum. And in December, the Minister of Defence detailed to the House a financial redress scheme that seeks to acknowledge the consequences of the ban. The government has increased the financial redress scheme from the original £50 million allocated by the previous government to £75 million, an increase of 50%. And I would strongly urge any eligible veterans from this time to contact the scheme as soon as they're able. More widely, 10 years ago, the United Kingdom was ranked as #1 nation in Europe for LGBT+ rights, protections and safety. The UK was a global example, not only of acceptance, but opportunity. But 10 years of subsequent Conservative governments has undermined that achievement, from shelving its own LGBT action plan to the embarrassing boycott of its own international LGBT conference to the flip-flopping and delays on banning conversion practices. The Conservative Party slid backwards towards the politics of division. This government aims to reverse that trend. The UK is proud to defend the human rights of LGBT+ people at home and around the world. We are proud members of the Equal Rights Coalition, which is an intergovernmental organisation dedicated to the protection of rights for LGBT+ people. The UK believes human rights are universal and apply equally to all people. This includes those who are LGBT+, who are some of the most systematically persecuted individuals in the world. Currently, 63 countries criminalise consensual same-sex acts. 13 countries can impose the death penalty. At least 49 countries use legislation to criminalise or harass transgender and gender-diverse people. Criminalisation of the LGBT+ people often stems from colonial-era legislation, often imposed by the UK itself. These laws uphold outdated views that undermine the rights of LGBT+ people. They were wrong then and they're wrong now. Our network of over 280 diplomatic missions works to tackle discrimination and end the violence and persecution that persists today. Our £40 million programme is helping improve political, social and economic empowerment by addressing outdated discriminatory laws, promoting protective legislation, enabling local civil society organisations and supporting the most vulnerable LGBT+ people in conflict and crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, today I have shared and detailed the Government's commitments. This Government stands ready to deliver for LGBT+ people, ending the dithering of recent years and lowering the temperature of toxic debate. May I conclude by saying that as part of the LGBT+ community myself and as Minister for Equalities, it's a privilege to open this debate and I look forward to contributions from across the House.
The question is that this House has considered LGBT+ History Month. I call Shadow Minister Mims Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is always a pleasure to be at the box on behalf of His Majesty's loyal opposition, and I particularly welcome the chance to be part of this debate, with it being LGBT+ History Month, which was first celebrated in 2005 and has been celebrated every February since. So a very happy 20th birthday. And I welcome the start of this debate by the Honourable Lady opposite, and particularly welcome her updates, in particular in regard to the CAS review on how we support our young people and their parents and carers. This year's theme for LGBT plus History Month is activism and social change. And it's very pleasing, meanwhile, that some honourable members are rightly in Westminster Hall currently debating HIV testing week as well. There has been, as we've heard, been some truly remarkable men and women who have fought for social change and, more substantially, a complete sea change, rightly, in social attitudes to LGBT plus people in the last few decades. And in fact, such a change that in 2019, under the Conservatives, Alan Turing placed on the £50 note. What progression. And the fact that we are now rightly, properly and joyfully able to celebrate gay marriage is such a huge step forward. As we heard from the Minister, that we as a country have apologised and worked to compensate our LGBT plus veterans and those who have been treated so abominably in the service of our country. The fact that we can celebrate those individuals in history properly, rather than seeing what they saw, the shameful treatment that they had. The fact that Alan Turing has been rightly celebrated just shows how much we've moved on. And I've met constituents, and I'm sure many honourable and right honourable members today who have been affected by the ban, and we welcome the memorial and we welcome the redress scheme. Now, nowhere have we seen most change in the last 40 years than is in the battle on HIV and AIDS. And I was pleased when I was very first appointed to this role as Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. One of my first meetings was with the wonderful Terence Higgins Trust. Terry Higgins was one of the first people in the UK to die of an AIDS-related illness. And that trust, in his name, Terence's name, was set up with the absolute intention of preventing others to have to suffer the way that he had. It focused on raising funds for research and awareness of the illness that at the time was called gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. The name itself being a marker of prejudice at the time. Now, the Trust was the first charity in the UK to be set up in response to the HIV epidemic, and they have been rightly at the forefront of the fight against HIV and AIDS ever since. And we heard from the Minister, this charity is just one of the groups who have driven real positive change. We are proud and thankful to them all for the work they've done then and now, and of course,
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and just been reminded of my first training with the Terence Higgins Trust around HIV and how it could be contracted. And the thing that stood in my mind the most, and education is absolutely key, that when people were saying that you could catch it by saliva, for instance, I remember the Terence Higgins Trust saying you would need literally 2 litres, like a big bottle of fizzy drink of saliva, that's one hell of a sloppy kiss, to be able to catch HIV. So does the Honourable Member agree with me that education is key, and they do an amazing job?
Absolutely, and I thank the Honourable Lady, who I have the pleasure of co-chairing the All-Party Women in Parliament group with. Absolutely, these stigmas, these mindsets, these myths, which have again divided and made life more difficult for people because of a lack of understanding and a promotion of fear. And I'm so pleased that we have been able to tackle those myths because of the work of that wonderful charity and many others. And it was a pleasure to meet with them most recently recently, and the Minister mentioned, around wider sexual health. And as a mum of two young daughters, the wider sexual health challenges for our young people continue to need to be met. Equally, the target of ending the new HIV cases by 2030. Indeed, I was honoured to be asked to speak alongside my honourable friends, the Right Honourable Member for Leith and Horncastle and the Right Honourable Member for Daventry at the Terence Higgins Trust event at my party conference last year. And at these events, we all spoke about the progress that's been made and the commitment about what more needs to be done to deliver that ambition of ending new HIV cases by 2030, and again to tackle that stigma. And we on this side of the House will work stridently with the government to meet that aim, as it truly is a cross-party, cross-community issue. Now, the last Conservative government, which in 2014 legalised self-testing kits for HIV, then in 2015 the rollout of self-testing in England, and in 2017 it was the rollout in England of the PrEP trial. And it is, of course, HIV testing week this week, which I'm very proud to say in 2012 was the Conservatives who funded the first ever one. I have 3 kits in my office to do exactly what we should all be doing. I'll be sharing, handing them out and doing one myself to show exactly how easy it is to do. And my fellow MP colleagues who represent a rural area such as myself will know that getting access to healthcare can be a challenge, and getting the message out around safe sex, for access to contraception, regular testing, the additional logistics of maybe being a young person living in a rural area must be understood. For example, in my constituency of East Grinstead, Uckfield and the villages, many of my constituents have to go to Brighton or Crawley to get a test, which is many miles away. For my younger constituents, where transport or connectivity, isolation or loneliness, and simply not having anyone to talk to about that need can be a problem. So I would encourage people to sign up to get a test online, to have one delivered to your door. It may be easier to do and appropriate. And I say to my constituents, as your MP, I am a champion for you, as you are hopefully feeling supported by me as young people, and I'm here to listen to you and stand up for your equality, and I'm sure all honourable members will feel the same. Now, my team over the last few years, both in the civil service when I served as a minister and in Parliament, I've enjoyed and often very much learned a lot from working with my friends and colleagues who are LGBT+. And I have been humbled by their bravery about how still it is often too hard to speak up about the person that you are and to be your true, authentic self. So I will champion my staff, my friends, and I'm sure we all will do in this House, to make sure that those opportunities for everyone to be their true, authentic self is able to be there. And because the truest Conservative beliefs are of freedom, equality, liberty and opportunity for all. Now, in October, as at Equalities Questions, I asked the Minister if the further £20 million commitment from the previous government was there in terms of the rolling out of the successful HIV hepatitis testing stood still. And I'm pleased to know that the Minister responded by saying that officials are working up plans. So if there is anything further that needs to be shared with the House today, I would welcome that. I'd also welcome the update on the RHSE guidance. It is under review. It's important that parents and loved ones know what is being discussed at school so they can discuss and support that at home. And I think, given the discussion this afternoon, that's all the more important. And more more broadly through the public health commissioners who are responsible for sexual health services locally, including the 2.3% cash increase last year. I hope the Minister will agree that we need to make sure that we see that delivery of progress and outcomes for those that need that support in our communities. Not least because there are worrying statistics from the UK HSA that there has been an increase in HIV infections amongst heterosexual men, and that all too often there is unsafe sex taking place, which sadly we know that puts some people at risk, and having the ability to ask people to test to have safe sex is absolutely vital, as much as consent. Now, in the very best traditions of this House, one government builds on the legacy of the previous one, and I'm very proud of the work that we did around making sure that anti-bullying schemes were rolled out for students in 2012 to support LGBT plus students. And the Minister opposite, I do welcome what she said to the House, bravery in every shape and form, and I thank her for sharing her challenges in the House. We're all learning together, and I'm delighted to support this debate today. In terms of 2017, the first ever LGBT plus survey of the population was undertaken under the Conservatives, and many other steps forward. And we must continue to, in the tradition of the change and tackling stigma, continue to reach further and important goals. And as a responsible opposition, of course, always rightly scrutinise and encourage to make sure we're all moving positively in the right direction. So I look forward to hearing the contributions from other members in the House today as we continue to stand up for our constituents, all of them, to challenge prejudice, to deliver the true equality of opportunity, to celebrate love for all in the memory of and on behalf of those who have led the way, and to continue to deliver for all our constituents whose happiness, success and rights matter to us all. Thank you.
Chair of the Select Committee, Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is always an honour to take part in this annual debate, commemorating, celebrating, protesting for LGBT plus History Month. I will start by saying I am incredibly disappointed, though, that there are not more members of the House here present to hear what I know will be a really informative, heartfelt, genuine debate. I know, as has already been mentioned, the theme for LGBT plus History Month this year is activism and social change. But given what the LGBTQIA+ community is facing at the moment in the media, in political rhetoric, I have to say that perhaps a more appropriate theme would be survival and existence. Powerful people, rich people, at home and abroad, punching down. Punching down. Referring to the LGBT community as woke, snowflake, weak, fragile. And any of us know that the LGBTQIA+ community is far from all of those things. Because fighting for who you are, to love who you want to love, in the face of hatred, humiliation and persecution, is one of the bravest things any one of us could ever do. And for the trans community, who have to live every day in a body that does not reflect who they truly are, that's courage. All against a backdrop of conversations about them, without them, particularly for trans men. Some of the strongest, least snowflake people I could ever have in my life are from the LGBT community. I am so proud to call them my friends. They're basically my extended family. They're the family I chose. And they fight to be who they are, and they fight to exist now. I'm going to give some personal examples of when I was perhaps at my most weakest. As a straight woman, I relied on that community and my friends to hold me up, because they had the strength when I didn't at that time. When I was in my 20s, when I used to go out, as Miley Cyrus says, you know, I used to be young, I was out with one of my gay best friends and my non-binary friends. We were out, we'd gone to a gay club, because unsurprisingly, and for whatever reason I can't possibly put my finger on it, I felt safer and able to have more fun in gay nightclubs than I did in straight clubs as a 20-year-old single woman of that time. I can't think why that might be. But we were on our way home. We wanted chips and a kebab. Standard, right? In the queue was a group of lads. They start giving abuse to me, sexual connotations, and me being myself, I didn't shut up. I didn't take that lying down. I gave as good as I was getting. They went ahead, and all of a sudden, when we came out with our chips and our kebabs, I could feel things hitting my head. They were throwing chips at us. Those chips suddenly became punches to my face, and they pushed me to the ground. And who stood up and fought for me? My gay best friend and my non-binary friend took on 5 blokes for me. I didn't stop fighting either, but they were there when I needed them. When it's come to campaigns, I've worked across different communities on all various campaigns, but particularly human rights campaigns. And when I've lost those campaigns, my dearest friend Paul was there for me to pick me up when I was crying, when I was broken, when I thought I couldn't carry on. But actually, he showed me the importance, because of his experiences of fighting for equality throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, and unfortunately now, through 2025. And my dearest friend Helgi. He was one of the first out LGBT council members of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. I have spoken quite often in this place about the multiple miscarriages that I have experienced. I couldn't have found myself at a more dark time than at that time. He was there in the surgery to hold my hand, to help me through one of the most difficult procedures to remove 2 of the babies that didn't make it out. And he was my friend when I was there and I woke up. That's the strength of the community. That's the strength of allyship. And right now, they're the ones being attacked. They're the ones feeling isolated. They're the ones feeling without hope. So I want to plead to every ally, to everybody, to use your voice to stand up for so many who have used their voices to stand up for our rights, our dignity, and our future as well. Yeah. So, with that, we had an election last year, and I am so proud that one of my first engagements, it was actually my first engagement in Luton, official engagement in Luton, was Pride in Luton. And it was bigger and better than ever, and every year it gets bigger and better, and there's more supporters, there's more attendees, and there's more fun. And I took my family with me, and my then 4-year-old, she asked me, "What's Pride?" "What's Pride, Mummy?" And I said, "Pride is a celebration, but it's also a protest." And she said, "Okay." I said, Pride is a protest and a celebration for people to love who they want to love and be who they are. And her reaction, "Okay," and shrugged. And we had the best time ever. And I hope long does that continue. But we didn't get here without a fight. People didn't get here without a fight. And over a decade ago, we've heard some of the fantastic measures that the previous Labour government took place. We know that they removed the terrible Section 28 law from the statute books, passed a law allowing trans people to legally change their gender, and introduced the Equality Act to protect LGBT+ people from discrimination. We know that Labour also lifted the ban on lesbian, gay men and bi people serving in the armed forces, introduced civil partnerships, which, yes, I will give credit where credit is due to the previous Conservative government, paved the way for same-sex marriage, and laws to allow unmarried couples, including same-sex couples, to apply for joint adoption. I am pleased that we have that legacy and foundation to build on, but build upon it we must. The plans proposed in the Labour manifesto was to deliver a trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, and at the Women and Equalities Committee yesterday, I am pleased that the Minister confirmed that that will be trans-inclusive still, and she gave her recommitment for that. We need to ensure that LGBT plus hate crime constitutes an aggregated offence in the same way it does for other hate crime offences. We need to bring forward a new HIV action plan, and I'm glad to see that many have spoken about that already. Right the wrongs endured by LGBT plus veterans, which I know this government is taking aim at, and modernise the law on gender recognition, and fix the NHS and recruit 8,500 more mental health workers. All of these are brave, they are good, they are laudable aims. But one thing that has been missing is a time frame, a schedule, for when all of these fantastic plans will be put into place. When will the LGBTQI plus community be able to feel the benefits of these laudable, great, good, beneficial aims? Because we have seen many in that community feel scared. It's not just looking across the pond and seeing that their existence has been completely wiped out by president and the richest man in the world. It is also a feeling that there is a row back here. And that is where I would like us to address some of the issues, and I hope the Minister will be able to rise, and if not write to me, to explain where we are with some of these points. Already mentioned is the indefinite ban on puberty blockers for trans young people. We held a Women and Equalities inquiry where actually I would like to say I'm proud that our entire committee, and I'm pleased to see committee members here today, although there was diverse opinion among committee members as well as the witnesses themselves, that debate was held with dignity, with respect, with evidence, with a willingness to try to understand, which I think has all too long been missing from all of that debate. I'm not yet to say what recommendations will come out because I will get into trouble. But I do think we need to be part of a solution. It's not just pointing out what the problems are. And with that in mind, as much as the Minister has said there were unclear risks of harm, we've also got to look at the unclear risks of harm of not being able to provide healthcare for trans people when they need it. What can be done to mitigate some of those harms? And we talked about vitamin D, we talked about calcium, we talked about healthy diets, all of those things that would address some of the concerns around puberty blockers. And why it is that the ban is explicitly only for their use to treat those with gender dysphoria. Why is it safe for people with endometriosis, with people with prostate cancer, or precocious prepubescence to take puberty blockers, and yet not so for those experiencing gender dysphoria? There was debate by people with endocrinologists with brains the size of small planets during that committee. It was incredibly informative. But there is much work to be done, but we need to make sure that that work is done fairly. We need to make sure that work is done inclusively, and we need to make sure that that work is done with the community, not against it. And there is also the reform and the plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for trans people to change their legal gender. I know that in previous articles, the Minister for Women and Equalities had called the process intrusive, outdated and humiliating in 2022. That is just as true today as it was then. And I would welcome from the Minister an update of when the GRA will be reviewed. Because while we all debate this, LGBTQ plus people are being isolated further. They're being targeted, they're being talked about, and that's coming through clear in the statistics. The number of hate crimes against LGBT plus people increased from 4,345 in 2011 to 2012 to 22,339 in 2023 to 2024. That increase is huge, and that is real people's lives. But also within that will be a huge amount of underreporting, because we know that only 1 in 8 people reported homophobic or transphobic hate crimes to the police. So the level of underreporting here, the trust that we need to build up, not just as a government but as a society as well, to protect the most vulnerable from crimes such as that, we have a lot of work to do. And when it comes to banning conversion therapy, it is something that has received cross-party support, and I would look forward to finding out when we will see a timeline for this ban to come into force and commit now that it will be trans-inclusive. We have heard that in the Select Committee yesterday, but I would be grateful if that commitment could be reiterated at the dispatch box today. And when will the ministers commit to a timeline to bringing forward the plan to make anti-LGBT hate crime an aggravated offence? We've spoken about the new HIV action plan and the work that was built on from the previous government, and I'm really pleased that we have that. It was so wonderful to see the Prime Minister casually taking a HIV test. That is something that we would not have heard of many, many years ago. We wouldn't have seen it. The stigma that the Minister spoke about and the Shadow Minister spoke about so eloquently, we would never have seen that, and my friend from Harlow as well. It's so important. Stigma is so important, but is also really difficult to break down when those that in power, in particular, continue to punch down. And we've seen that with President Trump's devastating cuts to US aid, which have left millions across the world without access to life-saving antiretrovirals. What will the UK be doing to fill this gap? Because as we have seen in the US, progress is not inevitable. It never is. I hope this government can address the concerns of the LGBTQI community and those who want to live in a society free from persecution and free from barriers to healthcare, services and safety, because we must stay united in the fight, because an attack on one of us is an attack on all, and hatred never stays in one lane for long. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure and an honour to follow the Honourable Member from Luton North, and I concur with everything she said about the work being done in the Women Affairs Committee, but how important it is today that we recognise the point at which we stand in our history, because often in this place when we talk about LGBTQ rights or women's rights or racial equality, we talk about the journey that we've been on and what we have achieved. And yes, we have achieved a lot, but at this particular moment in our history, we face enormous challenges. The LGBTQ community in our country need to look at us today and know that we will stand up for them, that we will fight for their right simply to be who they are. But we have faced challenges before, and we've overcome them. I think about Scotland, and my home city in particular of Glasgow, where I was brought up, where in the 1970s, and when I was a student in the 1980s, it had unfortunately garnered for itself the unenviable reputation of being one of the worst places in Europe to grow up gay. And with attitudes which somehow were more polarised in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. In 1957, a poll showed that more than 80% of Scots did not want homosexuality decriminalised. It was 51% in England. And in preparing for this debate, I found an article for a 1982 student newspaper from the University of Liverpool, whose student union disaffiliated with Glasgow because it refused to allow a gay society to form. According to the union president, it was on the grounds that the age of consent for homosexual sex at that point was 21. And given most students were younger than that, the union did not want to, and I quote, give the impression that the union in some way bestows an unofficial blessing on their activities. And many members of the Gay Society are not interested in a constructive approach to changing the membership's attitude, but using this as a ploy to gain momentum to destroy the character of the union as we know it. You know, there's an echo in that language. There's an echo that we hear today. But imagine how young LGBT people must have felt hearing that, reading that was the kind of attitude that they had to face on a daily basis. And imagine if you'd been able to tell them that 40 years later, Glasgow would be in the top 5 places in Europe for LGBT people to visit and enjoy. That despite those attitudes, there has grown a long, rich history of the community coming together to support each other across Scotland, and we've improved so much, as those figures show. But Edinburgh, for example, the Edinburgh Befrienders, later known as the Lothian Gay and Lesbian Switchboard, opened in 1974 and was the UK's first bespoke helpline for gay and lesbian people, beating Switchboard, which still exists, by just 1 day. Edinburgh was also home to Scotland's first LGBT bookshop, Lavender Menace, and in 1995 welcomed 3,000 people to Scotland's first Pride March. It's huge now. It's the event of the year, and I've been privileged to speak at it twice now. Of course, much of this change has been possible because of public figures, former MPs like Robin Cook, who equalised Scots law and English law on homosexuality. Like Val McDermid, whose 1987 novel Report for Murder featured Lindsay Gordon, Britain's first fictional lesbian detective, and award-winning author Jackie Kay, the second woman and first lesbian to hold the post of Macca, Scotland's national poet. Her work has dealt with race, gender, transgender identities and her own sexuality. It's thanks to people in places like these, so many attitudes, laws and the understanding of LGBT plus people have changed for the better. That the age of consent was finally equalised for gay and straight people in England, Scotland and Wales in 2000. Same-sex couples were recognised for the first time in 2004 with civil partnerships, the same year as trans people gained formal recognition in law for the first time with the Gender Recognition Act. And 20 years ago, the same-sex couples gained the right to adopt. My party, its politicians and its activists, has played a key role in that fight. As for me, the fight for LGBT plus rights is not just another political issue, but like the fight for all human rights, is part of who I am and what I believe and what my party stands for. As has already been mentioned, it was thanks to the allyship and hard work of my noble friend Baroness Featherstone that in 2013, the hundreds of thousands of campaigners and activists across this country finally had their voices heard with the achievement of marriage equality for same-sex couples. Sometimes, though, I think that this focus on the successes of LGBT rights and movement in the UK leads us to think that everything has been easy. Progress came without any great effort. It was quick and natural. And we forget the negatives, we forget the fights that we've been through, the moments of shame, because that is the only word, shame for our country. The treatment of gay men like Alan Turing, who was imprisoned, chemically castrated and shamed for his sexuality. The fact that before 2000 anyone could be dismissed from the armed forces simply for being gay. The public distrust, indeed hatred, that many gay men faced during the AIDS crisis. I grew up during that crisis, and the fear at times and the stigma was palpable in society. And despite the public solidarity and support from many lesbian groups, it continued. And of course, the lasting impact of Section 28 on a whole generation of young LGBT people who were not allowed to see themselves represented in schools or have appropriate protections from homophobic bullying. Now, we may think that these negatives are all in the past, but in recent years, we've seen horrible debates around LGBT rights, particularly trans rights, and they've become increasingly toxic. Many trans people see their identities as denigrated, their experiences ignored, and their lives sidelined in debates about their own rights and their own lives. Too many people forget that at the centre of these culture wars are real people who simply just want to live their lives, be left alone to be who they are. And it's time we moved that debate forward. It's time we thought about the people and not the politics. Focus on the solutions to the issues that the LGBTQ community still face. How we tackle the growth in hate crime, the misogyny and objectification faced by lesbians, and address the intersectional issues faced by black and minority ethnic or disabled LGBTQ people. And I am delighted to hear that the government's draft conversion practices ban will be heard soon. And how can we support schools and businesses? We must help them eradicate homophobic and transphobic bullying and harassment. We have to think about how we support trans people to access better support and how we help non-binary people get recognition in law. And I hope that the government will address all of these points. And actually, today I'm more confident that they will. The Honourable Member for Luton North mentioned her daughter as hope for the future. Now, my daughter is considerably older. She's in her 20s. And a couple of years ago, we went to a play together in Edinburgh. It was, and I always get the title wrong, The Trouble with Jamie, about a young trans cross-dressing guy who wants to wear a dress to the prom, and it causes all sorts of hassle. And I had seen the film and loved it, and it's why we went to the play. But about halfway through, I actually began to find the audience more interesting. And I realised that everybody in the audience under the age of about 35 or 40 was totally engaged in what was happening and was cheering for Jamie and booing his opponents. It was great. And everybody over the age of about 60 was looking stunned and looking round and, what's going on? And we came out and we were walking along the road, and I said this to my daughter Mary, and I said, "Your generation really don't care, do they?" She said, "No. We don't get it. We don't know why it's a problem, and we don't know why politicians don't see that." And in that moment, I thought, you know what? This debate that we all want to end, this toxic argument, it will end. It will end because the younger generation will not allow their peers to be punished for being who they are the way that mine were. So, can I thank the government for having this debate? And can I thank everyone who's here? And can I just say, please let's send a positive message that we will stand up and we will make that acceptance come sooner. Thank you.
Yeah. Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to be speaking in the main chamber in this Parliament, as Mr Speaker told us the other night at his reception, the gayest Parliament in the world. LGBT History Month has never been more needed than it is right now, with politicians of all political stripes here in the UK, in Europe, and of course in America, trying to tear down the few protections LGBTQ+ people have, attack our rights and rewrite history. Our history and our activism needs to be shouted about. We will not be silenced. We will not be erased. We will not be pushed back in the closet, and our history will be celebrated and remembered. We need people to continue to be brave enough to shout, "I am here." I'm a lesbian, and I'm saying that in the mother of all parliaments. And I will not stop shouting about it.
Our diversity is what makes us wonderful. It gives us strength. Dyke is no longer an insult, but a badge that I wear with pride, just like my she, her pronoun badge. It's been 40 years since I came out, and at that time I would never have imagined that I would be an out lesbian member of Parliament 40 years on. In those years we have seen huge improvements, but we also still have a really long way to go, and I would not have imagined that I would still be having the same slurs chucked at me now that I had chucked at me then. Arguments that tried to make it about LGBTQ plus people being a threat to kids. That is why LGBT History Month is so important. That is why our activism is so important. And that is why I always say that I'm an activist first and a politician second. We must celebrate our history and remind people that we have always been here, that trans people have always existed. But we also have to remember the lessons of our activism. Remember and listen to those who lived those fights and learn from them in order to defend ourselves and our community from this latest wave of attacks. Over the last few years, I've been repeatedly asked, why do we need LGBT History Month? Surely Pride isn't needed anymore. Hasn't equality gone too far? Yet now people are starting to understand why we still need these events. The fight to protect our rights never ends. Yet even this week, there are far too many people who are still making those types of comments. Too many people are woefully uneducated on LGBT history. On June the 28th, 1970, on the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, the first Pride marches were held in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Pride will always be a protest. Pride events are where our community, in all our diversity, make ourselves visible, stand up for our rights, our identities, and our very existence. It is where we use our voices and where allies show up in solidarity. Pride events are needed for LGBTQ plus visibility and solidarity, to celebrate the milestones achieved in the fight for equality and to remind us of the struggles that remain. Last year, the town I live in, Hebburn, held its first ever local Pride, thanks to Peter Darrant from out North East, who also runs the wonderful Pride Radio, which broadcasts nationally from my constituency of Jarrow and Gateshead East, and local business leaders like Wendy Stead and many others. They faced a barrage of abuse. They had the flags ripped down. The local paper removed the article about the event because of the thousands of abusive comments, and both Peter and I received some horrific homophobic and lesbophobic abuse online and in real life. Okay. I'm proud to say Peter, Wendy and the team are ensuring the local Pride goes ahead again this year, and I will be there. Yeah. But we need to see more solidarity from people in the face of this hatred, and we need to ensure Pride events are in every town and every city. We must tackle the rise in LGBTQ plus hate crime, and in particular the huge explosion in transphobic hate crimes over the last few years. These attacks reflect an increasingly hostile environment, exacerbated by negative media and political rhetoric, not just in the US, but in Europe and here in the UK. Just last week, we saw a GB News host link LGBTQ plus people to paedophilia. And previously, we had the leader of the opposition refer to trans people as an epidemic. And as I've reminded her before, the definition of which is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease. It's no wonder with language like that under the last Conservative government, the number of hate crimes committed on the basis of sexual orientation increased from around 4,000 in 2011-2012 to nearly 23,000 in 2023-24. This is a disgrace. And I'm pleased our government has promised to tackle hate crime by ensuring that LGBTQ+ hate crime constitutes an aggravated offence. And I have to echo the words of the Chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee. It's so disappointing to see not one opposition MP on our backbenches here today. Previous Labour governments have ensured equality was at their heart, and I'm so pleased that our first ever out lesbian minister, the Right Honourable Member for Wallasey, is continuing that work as a minister in this government. And I also want to pay tribute to the work of the Minister for Equalities leading our debate today, for making sure that we had this debate in government time, as well as for everything that she is doing to deliver a fully inclusive ban on so-called conversion practices. I'm proud that our government has been clear that these conversion practices are abuse. They are acts that aim to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, mostly in relation to LGBT+ people, and we will ban them. I'm proud that it was Labour that lifted the ban on lesbians, gay men and bi people serving in the armed forces, introduced civil partnerships and laws to allow unmarried couples, including same-sex couples, to apply for joint adoption. I'm proud that we're bringing forward a new HIV action plan, and I was pleased to speak at an event jointly sponsored by the BGIPU and the Elton John Foundation in Parliament earlier this week. And I'm proud that despite media reports to the contrary, we will be bringing forward our manifesto commitments to modernise, simplify and reform the intrusive and outdated gender recognition law and remove indignities for trans people, as well as ensuring all discrimination and financial barriers are removed for same-sex IVF provision. However, I do want to once again bring a note of caution around our government's own policy and rhetoric on puberty blockers. I believe this decision is putting people's health at risk. I sit on the Council of Europe, and they have released a report that notes the total withdrawal of access to puberty blockers outside of a research trial in the UK may breach the fundamental ethical principles governing research, and I want to urge ministers to look at this report and consider it in detail. I want to thank Sue Sanders, the founder of LGBT History Month. We must remember our history, but also acknowledge those who continue to fight now, like Lord Cashman and Baroness Barker, Linda Riley from Diva, Simon Blake from Stonewall, Shiv, who is organising the London Dyke March, Marty Davies, who is doing so much to ensure that trans history is recognised, and those who make all of these things happen from behind the scenes, like Marsha Jane Thompson, who has done so much work in this space for decades. You are pushing for our history to be remembered, for our rights to be defended, and it is you who will be remembered in future history books. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank you for being such a great ally, for co-hosting the first all-trans panel with me in the last Parliament, giving trans people a voice, and co-hosting events during Lesbian Visibility Week with me also. Our collective efforts can, do and will continue to make a difference by standing together, advocating for change and supporting organisations that champion LGBTQ+ rights. We can create a more inclusive and just world for all. Thank you.
Tracy Gilbert.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a privilege to speak in this debate. Although in writing my speech ahead of today, I couldn't help but feel old. We're here to debate LGBT+ History Month, and as a woman of a certain age, I've had a stark and daunting realisation I am so old I'm part of history. We're all aware of the stories of now famous LGBT+ people who were remarkable in their own field, but lived too early to enjoy the progress we have now achieved. Alan Turing, mentioned earlier, springs to mind. In many senses, his story is now legend. The understanding of the role he played in protecting this country is universal. That he happened to be gay shouldn't have mattered.
But despite his service, he was chemically castrated and suffered for the rest of his life. It was absolutely correct that the last Labour government apologised and that Hume was pardoned in August 2014. Madam Deputy Speaker, LGBT plus History Month is often marked and reflected through stories, and today I want to share just some of my story. Growing up in a mining town in the 80s, the difference in the rights I now have compared to then is striking. As a lesbian woman, I have spent my adult life fighting for LGBT plus rights. It was when fighting for these rights that I first visited this place. After many years of debate and setbacks, in June 1998, this House voted to equalise the age of consent between heterosexual and gay men. As an active member of Unison City of Edinburgh lesbian and gay self-organised group, we have been campaigning for many years to end this discrimination. The Unison Archive reminded me that our branch wrote letters to all Scottish MPs and MPs who had a link with our union, 320 in total. On the day of the vote, 2 of us came to this place to lobby MPs in person to vote for this historic change. Madam Deputy Speaker, the next big fight for our rights that I was actively involved in was the repeal of Section 28 or 2A in Scotland. As someone who worked in local government and who had a same-sex partner with children, I saw the damage that Section 2A had every single day. The Act meant that teachers and youth workers couldn't provide support for children with same-sex partners or LGBT plus young people. It resulted in many public sector workers feeling they couldn't come out in their own workplace, and colleagues, particularly who worked in education, and the law essentially said that households like the one I lived in were just wrong. When the Scottish Executive announced that they would repeal Section 2A, there was a considerable and at times vile campaign against its removal, much of this financed by Brian Souter. Brian Souter wanted to bankroll a private referendum and campaign for people to vote no. The campaign had billboards across Scotland opposing the repeal. One of these billboards was on Ferry Road, one of the main bus routes through my home in Edinburgh North and Leith constituency. I'll never forget having to take David and Zoe on a bus to school, passing the sign that said our family wasn't a real family. I can't put into words the anger I felt because of the worry it created for me and the kids and their mum. Thankfully, the people of Scotland rejected the buying of democracy by Brian Souter, and the referendum never happened. A few years ago, the Scottish Trade Union Congress commissioned a book celebrating 125 years of trade union successes in Scotland, and as a contributor, I wrote about the struggle. In the book, I said an overarching worry for the general public was that Souter was trying to bankroll this referendum and campaign. People didn't want private rich people to be able to buy democracy. I know my constituents still hold this view. The following decade and a half brought significant improvements in the rights of LGBT plus people in Scotland and across the UK. One of those rights I look forward to reflecting on in a few weeks' time when I celebrate my first wedding anniversary with my wife. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, the struggle for LGBT rights has been fought in workplaces, in our communities, within our families and across this House for decades. We have had many successes, but sadly still today there are people living in fear of their lives because they love someone of the same sex. We must in this place continue to fight to ensure that everyone is able to love who they wish, regardless of where they are born, and my hope is that very soon people across the world will have the freedoms that I enjoy here in the UK today. Thank you.
Yeah. David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend for Edinburgh North and Leith must have been thinking the same way as me when she wrote her speech, because LGBT History Month for me is always a time to reflect on the past. And at 47, I think I've got a fair bit of past now that I can reflect on. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was all too aware of the challenges of HIV and AIDS. Many will remember those terrifying TV adverts, the public health campaign that was regularly played out on TV. And the reality was, it was a terrifying time, as there was no cure and there wasn't any real treatment. AIDS was a death sentence. This in itself led to a stigmatised perception of the gay community in particular. As we all know, the gay community was disproportionately affected by the disease. My lecturer at Performing Arts School, Dr. Nick Phillips, was the first person I met who had AIDS, and this was in 1996. Nick had been well known in the 70s and 80s for his performances with the famous Blue Lips cabaret troupe, and he had performed extensively both here in the UK and in the US. It was his stint in the US which saw him tragically become one of the first people to catch HIV, as did, unfortunately, many of his friends. I saw Nick do a touching solo performance, which he wrote around 8 years ago, in which he portrayed the heartbreak of this period for him, losing so many friends whilst dealing with his own potential mortality. Despite there being no treatment, Nick miraculously survived, when many didn't, and he's still around today to tell the tale. When I first met Nick and became a close friend of his, I had to overcome my own prejudice, touching, giving him a hug, a peck on the cheek. I was one of many who was still absolutely petrified of this incurable illness in the 1990s. But Nick helped me see that it didn't have to be a death sentence. It also didn't mean I couldn't catch it. It also meant I couldn't catch it by just giving Nick a hug. I remember Nick getting really ill in 1997 and ending up in hospital. He was one of the first to receive the experimental treatment of combination therapy, and it worked. Nick went on to compose the touching Red Ribbon Requiem, which was performed by the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. Today, he's demonstrated just how far treatment has come, living a normal life, healthy life, and having naturally fathered 2 lovely twin boys. Fast forward to 2020, and a really close friend of mine sat me down to tell me he had HIV. My immediate reaction was despair. I thought I was going to lose him, that he had that death sentence. But he laughed at me and said, "No, don't worry. My levels are already now undetectable because of the wonderful medication that he was taking. So as long as he keeps taking this, he will now go on to live a normal life." Today, more than 30 HIV medications are available. Many people are able to control their HIV with just a single pill a day. Early treatment can prevent HIV-positive people from getting AIDS and the diseases it causes, like cancer. HIV drugs also stop people who have the virus from passing it on during sex. We still don't have a cure for AIDS, but with the right treatment, people who are HIV positive can live a normal lifespan. But we've got to remember, HIV and AIDS doesn't just affect the LGBTQ+ community. It doesn't discriminate like those who have been victims of the virus have been discriminated against in the past. Whilst most people have caught the disease from unprotected sex, regardless of their sexualities, others too have contacted it from infected blood, from their parents during pregnancy, from sharing needles, or from being horribly raped. I fully support this Labour government's new HIV action plan to end all new HIV cases in England by 2030, and I'm pleased that there's a cross-party consensus on this. The powerful image just this week of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom publicly taking an HIV test on camera was wonderful. I took my test too, and I encourage everybody to do the same. As we look to the future, with this Labour government bringing forward greater protections for the LGBTQ+ community, such as the trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices and righting the wrongs caused to the LGBT veterans, we would think that we would have reason to celebrate. But as others have said, we must be aware. The narrative with some is shifting. We've seen our trans community under attack, being made to feel non-existent. We've seen those in power around the world in countries we normally consider as being progressive, rowing back on LGBTQ+ rights. We sadly even hear rhetoric coming out of this place, and I have given pre-notice to the Honourable Member for Great Yarmouth, who this week stated that he would sack every DEI officer in the NHS and telling them how much he detests their work on social media just this weekend. Let's look at this. D, diversity, diverse people, people from a diverse background. E, equality, helping those diverse people gain equality, feel equal. I, inclusion, making them feel they are included in society. How dare somebody say they want to ban that? We need to call these people out. Those who are looking to push us back, take away our rights, making diversity irrelevant as opposed to embracing it. We are a diverse country and we should be embracing everybody, whoever they are. We've made huge strides forward, so please let's not go back. Finally, I want to pay tribute to all the pride organisations across the country. Many of them are run by volunteers, for the wonderful work they do in raising awareness, creating visibility, and also creating safe spaces for the LGBTQ+ community. I want to particularly call out Basildon Pride, where I am still Chair of Trustees, and the wonderful Southend Pride, who offer so much to the community, and long may they continue to do so. Thank you.
Nadia Whittome.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just start by saying, paying tribute to the Minister who so bravely spoke about the realities of teaching under Section 28 and how she did her best to protect LGBT children in her class, and I'm so glad that she is now able to do so in government. I also want to pay tribute to the chair of the Select Committee. She has always been such a staunch and fearless ally and speaks about these issues with such warmth, compassion, humanity and empathy. And I think actually today we've seen some of the best of all parties represented here. The Shadow Minister has always been a voice within her own party. The Lib Dem spokesperson has long been ahead of much of this House, actually, when it comes to equalities issues, including being outspoken in support of sex workers' rights, who must never be excluded from conversations around feminism and LGBTQ equality. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am thrilled that we have the opportunity to discuss LGBT History Month in the Chamber for many reasons, but not least because it gives me the opportunity to put on record just how gay Nottingham is and has long been. I was overjoyed to learn that Mansfield Road, where my constituency office is based, was home to queer-friendly cafes in the 1960s, and just down the road in St Anne's there was a flourishing lesbian pub scene. Nottingham also had a trans meet-up group all the way back in the 1970s, again disproving the lie that trans people have only existed more recently. And people in our city were active in the Section 28 protests, in fighting the AIDS crisis, and in running life-saving phone support lines. And I was privileged to meet some of them at Silver Pride, a social group for older gay and bi men in Nottingham. And it's thanks to CJ de Barra that much of this history and more is being uncovered. They've interviewed over 150 members of our community and delved deep into archives around the country to ensure that the history of Nottingham's LGBTQ+ community is preserved, highlighted and celebrated. I'd also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to many of the groups that support and advocate for LGBTQ+ people in Nottingham today. Not's LGBT+ network, Not's Pride, the Pastoral Project, Nottingham Against Transphobia, Silver Pride, the Nottingham Centre for Transgender Health, Not's Trans Hub and more. Those involved are unsung heroes, often volunteers, who work tirelessly to improve the lives of people in our community, and they deserve huge thanks and recognition. As well as marking LGBT History Month, this debate also coincides with HIV Testing Week. I want to commend the Prime Minister for being the first to take a public HIV test. At the height of the AIDS crisis, this would have been unthinkable, and it demonstrates just how far we've come in this regard. It's thanks to activists who have fought so hard for proper treatment, for funding for research against ignorance and stigma, that we are where we are today. HIV is no longer a death sentence, far from it, and ending the epidemic is possible. UNAIDS has set a goal of 2030, and it's vital that our government plays its part in helping to achieve this, and I welcome our commitments in this area. While it's right that progress is celebrated, this cannot come at the expense of recognising where we are continuing to fall short and even going backwards in some areas. Many of the struggles of the past are also struggles of the present. The LGBTQ+ community continues to face huge inequality, with trans people at the sharpest end, from higher levels of homelessness to discrimination at work and school, to an increased likelihood of experiencing verbal and physical abuse, and yes, disproportionate rates of suicide. This isn't hyperbole, and to recognise this sad reality isn't in some way irresponsible either. Life for many LGBTQ+ people is still immensely difficult. We are living in an era of rising hate, both here and around the world, which is putting more people at risk. The state of politics on LGBTQ+ issues is appalling. Trans people have been made a political football, with their suffering almost considered a price worth paying to score political points. And this makes some people feel tempted, I think, just to ignore the reality that trans people face, or to try to find some kind of so-called middle ground. But when a conversation has been dragged so far to the extreme right by anti-trans activists, the middle ground is far from moderate. History shows us that the answer isn't ceding ground to the right's framing, it is fighting back. Generations of queer activists held fast in demanding their rights, and they won them eventually. So I want to make clear, as a feminist and as a woman who isn't trans, that I am proud to stand with my trans siblings. Those claiming that standing up for my rights as a woman requires rolling back the rights of trans people do not speak for me. And when people with very loud voices and newspaper columns tell us that there is a conflict between trans rights and women's rights and that they're standing up for women, they're just not being honest. From the abuse towards women of colour competing in sports, to cisgender lesbians being harassed in bathrooms, attacks on trans people endanger all women who don't fit within anti-trans activists, ever narrowing, heteronormative and Eurocentric parameters of womanhood. And actually, far from advocating for women's rights, they're putting them under threat. Whether they realise this or not, they are helping usher in the far right, who want to restrict women's freedom and reinforce traditional gender roles. For example, we see time and time again campaigns against trans rights and against abortion rights, often working hand in hand, because they are part and parcel of a politics that is being dragged ever rightwards. Entire Conservative leadership contests have now been fought on the basis of who can talk the toughest when it comes to an extremely marginalised group. The Conservative Party has gone from supporting gender recognition reform under the May government and promising to outlaw conversion therapy, to outright opposing the first and coming up with excuses to allow the second to continue. And I'm extremely sad to say that my party too has been dragged in the wrong direction. Our policy on trans issues is worse now than it was in previous years. This is the wrong approach. Our party must completely reject the tired narrative that trans people are a threat, which is what is underpinning so much of this moral panic. It wasn't true about gay men in the 80s, and it is not true about the trans community now. Our approach must centre trans people themselves and their humanity. We must stand against bigotry for human rights and deliver material change, from the trans-inclusive conversion therapy ban and reform to the gender recognition process that we have promised, to proper access to gender-affirming healthcare for trans people of all ages, including making sure that everybody who needs them has access to puberty blockers. And, of course, creating inclusive schools and expanding affordable housing. LGBT history is not just in the past, it's being made every day. Labour is now in government, and we have to decide what role we want to play. Previous Labour governments, thanks to years of campaigning by LGBTQ+ people, took important strides, equalising the age of consent, repealing Section 28, and legislating for civil partnerships for adoption rights and gender recognition. The future that the next generation of LGBTQ+ people have will at least be in part shaped by our party. That generation will judge us on our record, and we still have time to make it one to be proud of. So I want to speak directly to them, to LGBTQ+ youth. I know that for so many of you, life is really hard and your future feels uncertain. There is no doubt that this chapter of history and the direction in which the world is moving often feels dark. But you are not alone. There are so many people who love you and accept you, not just accept you, but celebrate you for who you are, both within our LGBTQ+ community and outside it. Our history is one of struggle, but not every chapter has been bleak. We've faced down bigotry and we've won rights. And throughout it all, queer joy has always coexisted. A better world is possible, and I hope that one day the need for struggle and the feelings of darkness have gone, and that our joy is all that remains. Until then, we will keep fighting.
Alison Hume.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this important debate marking LGBT plus History Month, and it's an honour to follow the speech made by my honourable friend for Nottingham East. One of my predecessors as MP for Scarborough and Whitby, Paul Latham, who was MP for the constituency from 1931 to 41, was imprisoned for 2 years after being arrested for improper behaviour while serving in the Royal Artillery during the Second World War. And his story is a case of how so often LGBT plus people have been hidden from history as they faced prejudice, persecution, and in the case of men who were gay, prosecution. Paul Latham's arrest drove him to try to end his life, which only resulted in a charge of attempted suicide being added to indecent conduct. A very sad story, but hardly exceptional. The post-war period then saw a sharp rise in Britain in the number of prosecutions for homosexual acts, with the fine for a first offence being the equivalent of £700 today, and second offences punishable on average by a sentence of 1 to 5 years. Thankfully, in 1967, the then Labour Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, provided parliamentary time for Leo Absey's 10-minute rule bill to decriminalise homosexuality through the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. But of course, there was still a long way to go to full equality. Even as recently, fairly recently, as 1980, Scarborough Town Council, for example, refused permission for the Campaign for Homosexual Equality to hold a conference in the town, something which damaged not only Scarborough's reputation at the time, but also its tourist trade. So the success of today's Scarborough Pride is therefore all the more welcome and cause for celebration. Of course, there are other Pride events in nearby York and Leeds, but it's so important for the community in Scarborough to be visible. And it is at Pride, with over 3,000 people taking part since it restarted in 2023. I have taken part in both joyous parades, joining the Scarborough and Whitby Labour Party, carrying their splendid LGBTQ+ banner, along with my dog Tarka, resplendent in her rainbow neckerchief, as they wound their way cheerfully through the town centre and along Foreshore Road towards Scarborough Spa, where the festivities continue with fabulous performances, stalls and delicious food. Of course, Tarka particularly appreciates the latter. Local businesses along the route decorate their shops and windows, putting pride flags out to show their support, with the whole town getting into the spirit of the event. And it's a fun day. But it also helps to combat the feelings of isolation that LGBT plus residents feel. And of course, it has an educational value, breaking down barriers through family-friendly entertainment so that future generations of their community will not have to experience the prejudice that older members have. McCain Foods, a local major employer, has gone above and beyond in supporting the event, but funding, as for so many other charities, has been a struggle for the organisers, who will give their time for free, and I'd like to pay tribute to the wonderful volunteers there. And I know that Scarborough Pride would welcome offers of support for this year's Pride, which takes place on the 13th of September, celebrating inclusivity, diversity and love on the Yorkshire coast. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, further up the coast in Whitby, we enjoy a massive outpouring of love and acceptance twice a year as hordes of splendidly costumed goths visit the town in April and October. However, as we've heard in the House today, and we know from our own experiences, the LGBT plus community continue to suffer from abuse and discrimination. There is a brilliant exhibition of photos from Scarborough Pride last year that's running at Scarborough Art Gallery as part of LGBT plus History Month. But sadly, the comments section of a Yorkshire Post article about the exhibition have had to be switched off because of the vile nature of many of the posts. We have seen so much progress, legislation to introduce civil partnerships and to allow same-sex couples to adopt children, the equalisation of the age of consent and the repeal of Section 28, all under the last Labour government, followed by the right of same-sex couples to marry under the coalition government. And I'm so pleased to see this government taking action to right a historic wrong and compensate LGBT plus veterans who were dismissed from the armed services in the past because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, which the Defence Secretary has called a moral stain on our nation. Madam Deputy Speaker, an honest look at history means confronting the prejudice and often brutal treatment that LGBT plus people have suffered in the past and continue to experience. It means facing the fact that progress hasn't been smoothly linear, but a case of stops and starts, where each step forward has had to be fought for bravely so that people can be who they really are without fear. As the Member of Parliament for Scarborough and Whitby and a proud ally of the LGBT plus community, I am committed to playing my part in the push towards progress, towards the future where our children can live their lives free from judgment and discrimination, and they can be their best, brightest and authentic selves.
Olivia Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what a huge privilege it is to speak in this debate this afternoon. There's been so many wonderful contributions, and I'd like to thank all colleagues for them. Since I've been an MP, the question I think I get asked the most is, why is it you wanted to get into politics? Why is it you decided to become an MP? Often by groups of A-level students or kids in schools. And the honest answer to that question is because I know that politics changes lives, because it has changed my life. I grew up under Section 28, feeling like who I was something to be ashamed of. And then it was people in this place who, when I was 16, scrapped Section 28, so my school could no longer deny my existence. When I was 17, passed a law to allow civil partnerships and give me belief that I could have a relationship viewed as equal. When I was at university, passed the Equality Act that outlawed discrimination against me. And then when I was 26, I embraced my now wife in Parliament Square as equal marriage became law. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it is because of all of this that today my wife and I have two wonderful children, the love and respect of our families, and I am able to stand here today as a proud lesbian MP. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to speak in this debate for LGBT History Month. It's an important chance for us to reflect on our history and the brave pioneers who have come before us. And it's been wonderful to hear many of their stories today. But I want to use my speech today to celebrate not those who have achieved prominence, but everyday people who have persisted, who in living their lives, who in having the courage to be themselves, are the reason that we've made the progress we have today. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the real challenge, I think, for every LGBT plus person is not a battle with their career or their personal ambitions. The real battle each and every one of us faces is a battle with shame. Because when you are told that you are disgusting, when you are told that there is something wrong with you, it eats at you. It eats at your very sense of self. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, every time in our history that an LGBT person has steeled their nerves and held hands in the street, every time they chose to tell a colleague or a friend the pronoun of their partner or chose to express their gender, every time they chose love over fear, they showed an almighty act of strength, the most powerful political act there can be. An individual act of defiance, of courage, and today we stand here because of each and every one of them. Madam Deputy Speaker, We have achieved so much as a community, but I want to conclude by reflecting on the work still to do and the importance that this government places on advancing LGBT plus rights. Because our journey is not complete when there is still so much hate towards gay and trans people, while converting practices still take place, and while our gender recognition laws remain out of date. And that is why I am so proud that this government will deliver a trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, will make LGBT plus hate crime an aggravated offence, and will modernise the law on gender recognition. Madam Deputy Speaker, the best way to honour the LGBT plus people who have, throughout history, fought for our rights, often at great personal cost, is to never be complacent, is to link arms as a community, and it is to make it our solemn mission to ensure Pride is not just our protest against the pernicious effects of shame, but something felt freely by every LGBT person, finally allowed to just be who they are.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for allowing me to speak as a lesbian MP and as co-chair of the now very large Parliamentary Labour Party LGBT plus group on what is the 20th anniversary of LGBT plus History Month. LGBT plus History Month was first celebrated in 2005, but I first came to this country well before that, in the early 1990s. And for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people, it was a very different place to what it is now. We were a community ravaged by the HIV epidemic that killed so many people, and so many young people. But in a cruel twist, LGBT plus people were blamed for the very epidemic that was killing us. It was this that led to Section 28, that pernicious conservative law that put teachers in fear of being sacked if they even acknowledged our existence. It left many LGBT plus kids alone and often bullied mercilessly at school. And on the streets, LGBT plus people were in fear of their lives. In 1990, in my own constituency of Ealing Southall, Michael Booth was kicked to death by 6 men in Elthorne Park in Hanwell, simply because he was gay. Both the stigma of HIV and the chilling effect of Section 28 kept so many people in the closet, living lives they couldn't be honest about for fear of the consequences. Unable to be open to their own families, always fearful of being outed, of being beaten up, of losing their ability to earn a living. In the 1990s, you could be sacked from your job just because of who you loved. And as unreal as it now seems, you could even be refused service by a shop, a hotel, or a restaurant because you were gay. There was no law against it. How life has changed since then. The last Labour government transformed LGBT plus people's lives. We repealed Section 28. We lifted the ban on LGBT people in the military. We equalised the age of consent. We outlawed discrimination against LGBT plus people in society and in the workplace. We gave LGBT plus people the right to adopt and to access NHS fertility treatment. We brought in tougher sentences for anti-LGBT plus hate crimes, with the first ever conviction for the homophobic murder in the case of Jodie Dabrowski on Clapham Common. We introduced civil partnerships giving same-sex partners the same rights as married couples. We changed the law to finally acknowledge trans people's right to live their lives. And one of Labour's final acts in government was the groundbreaking 2010 Equality Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour built a more equal society. But since then, progress on LGBT plus equality has been painfully slow or gone backwards in many respects. Anti-LGBT plus hate crime soared to record levels under the last Conservative government. No surprise, given they demolished neighbourhood policing in this country. They slashed funding to local councils so that life-saving services for young LGBT plus people, like youth clubs and libraries, and specialist housing and sexual health workers, were cut. and they fanned the flames of a toxic debate about trans people's right to exist. It has taken a new Labour government to pick up where we left off and restart the work that is still needed to ensure equality for LGBT plus people. We're righting the wrongs of the past by paying compensation to those sacked from the armed forces for being LGBT plus. We're rolling out opt-out HIV testing, with the Prime Minister himself taking a test on camera this week. And we've opened the first of 6 new trans healthcare hubs. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's still too easy for employers to sack an LGBT plus worker but pretend it was nothing to do with discrimination. So Labour's Employment Rights Bill introduces a new day one protection against any unfair dismissal, which should make it harder for employers to get away with discriminating. Our plan to end 0 hours contracts will help stop young and low-paid LGBT plus workers being denied work because of who they are. LGBT plus workers often have to come out to their employer when asking for time off, but the Employment Rights Bill introduces a new day one right to bereavement leave and a default right to flexible working, both of which will make it easier for LGBT plus workers to get what they're entitled to without having to tell their life story to their employer. Now, the Minister has confirmed that she will reform outdated gender recognition laws and will soon be coming forward with inclusive plans to outlaw conversion practices, a promise repeatedly made by the last Conservative government, but which they again and again failed to deliver. Labour will finally stop this licensed abuse of LGBT plus people. And as part of our plan for change, we will be modernising healthcare for trans people and will be putting a specialist mental health professional in every school. We're also rolling out Young Futures hubs in every community, bringing back those youth services. This Labour government will also put neighbourhood police back on our streets and make LGBT plus hate crime an aggravated offence. Madam Deputy Speaker, LGBT plus History Month is a time to celebrate everything that has been achieved, but also to acknowledge the work still to do to win true equality. This new Labour government will transform LGBT plus people's lives again, just like we did before. And our plan for change will rebuild the NHS, the police and the education system that we all need, whether we're LGBT plus or not. Thank you.
Mims Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with leave of the House, it is a great privilege to close the debate for these benches on behalf of His Majesty's loyal opposition. I would like to thank the many members of this House who've made their contributions this afternoon, and also to Mr Speaker for his reception recently celebrating LGBT plus History Month. And also, Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for all that you do in this space. This afternoon, it's been a really important, wide-ranging debate, and I do apologise that many of my colleagues are also in Westminster Hall on the other debate, so and there's not as many of us as before, so it's slightly troubling. I'm sure some people are quite pleased about that. Now, one thing that particularly strikes me was the words of last year's debate. In the debate, my former colleague and dear friend, the former member for Carshalton and Wallington, Elliot Colburn, in last year's debate, he said LGBT plus people have always existed. We did not just pop out of the ground in the 1960s and 70s and start marching through the streets of London and other cities. And that, again, has struck me very stridently this year. And I say to him and Jed, the best night ever was their engagement. And to the former member for Sutton and Sheen, Paul Scully, and I had a brilliant evening, and we are still waiting for that wedding. I say to the Honourable Lady opposite, the Minister, I absolutely agree that the sub-40s do not see or feel any difference, and I think that has been roundly celebrated in the Chamber this afternoon. And in rejecting and frankly moving on from the culture wars, we must all keep compassion, safety, fairness, equality for all at the heart of this debate. And if we do this, LGBT plus History Month, we will do the debate justice. And it's a pleasure, as I say, to speak on my party's behalf. The Honourable Member for Jarrow and Gateshead East spoke about the importance of allies, and I think that it is extremely important. The Honourable Lady opposite, the Minister, talked about Fast Track Cymru and welcomed that work, and I think there has been lots of huge and ongoing work that if we all put every sinew to it, makes such a big difference. And the Chair of the Select Committee highlighted that it is far from weak to show who you really are and to be visible, and that the friendship that our LGBT plus trans community friends give us is wonderful, that they are heroes to us, and that the best nights out are with our LGBT plus friends. And probably as a heterosexual woman of a certain age in the gayest parliament in the world, probably explains my ongoing single status of why I have such a good time. The Honourable Member for Edinburgh West spoke about the work of very many individuals who continue to stand up and help those friends, constituents, colleagues come forward, and as allies, that difference that it makes will never change. And I absolutely agree with the point that she made, that furthering causes by putting individual safety at risk is extremely unhelpful, and rights are not a zero-sum game. The Honourable Lady from Edinburgh North and Leith spoke about the work that she had long done in this area and the importance of recognising families come in all shapes, sizes and forms. And as a single parent for not far off the last decade, I think there's still much stigma of what a family looks and feels like, and we all need to keep working to tackle that. The Honourable Member for Southend West and Leigh spoke about the incredible Nick. I think we'd all love to meet Nick, reflecting on how those living with HIV and AIDS, losing friends and facing their own mortality was extremely powerful. But he also mentioned the power of hugs. Hugs for all make everybody feel better indeed. The Honourable Lady from Nottingham East spoke about bravery, and she is absolutely a brave member. She is always happy to speak on what she truly believes in, and that is all you can ask for in this house. So all power to her. And the Honourable Lady from Reading West and Mid Berkshire talked about linking arms, and I love that. That's such a powerful image for us. The Honourable Lady from Scarborough and Whitby spoke about pride events and the opportunity to feel part of something bigger, to tackle that isolation and loneliness. And I'm very proud as our party brought forward the first Minister for Loneliness. And I, alongside the former wonderful member of this House, Tracy Crouch, had that role. And what a brilliant, amazing, globally recognised role it shapes. And those Pride marches are a great opportunity to break down isolation and loneliness. There's a couple of questions I have for the Minister. The amendment that we've put forward to the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, we Conservatives do think it's important. I highlighted this in my earlier comments, that parents, loved ones, carers can view what's going on in the classroom in RHSE, and the Honourable Lady shared about her challenges in the classroom. And I wonder if she'd had parental support back then and was able to share those materials, would make life be easier. So I think it's reiterate to parents, carers and loved ones that if we want true understanding, then true discussion and conversations at home matter equally. I also want to use this opportunity opportunity to urge the Minister to work with me to help stand up for women on the Women's Health Strategy. I know that we rightly need to make sure that we're focused on equality and fairness for all, and I do hope that perhaps in her position on behalf of all women, whatever their sexual orientation, that we are very clear that we have that focus, because women's health needs are different, so that we can be fair, we can promote equality for all, we can protect our children, we can focus on liberty, but make sure that women's health is at the heart of this as well. And some of the strongest and truest conservative beliefs, as I said earlier, are freedom, and that those opportunities for liberty and equality should always be at the heart of this discussion. I mentioned some of the milestones from my party, and I do think back in 2013 the Conservatives funding the first ever HIV testing campaign for BAME was extremely important. In 2019 our party elected the most openly LGBT plus MPs for any party. I know it's been possibly slightly superseded over these last few months, and this was recognised by as the legislature in the world that had more MPs than the entire Congress who were LGBT plus. So quite amazing, really. In terms of reducing diagnosis of HIV by 73%, we achieved that as Conservatives in 2001. In the same year, the number of people living over the age of 50 hit an all-time high, and the highest in the world. And we introduced the action plan in 2021, which needs to be updated by 2030 to end those HIV infections. In 2022, people with HIV and no detectable virus were rightly able to join the military and fully deploy on operations. And in 2023, removed barriers for IVF for lesbian couples. And in 2024, HIV removed from IVF applications. So I say to young people listening and watching, this is a really important reminder of why months, Madam Deputy, like this, of celebration are really important for us. And of course, this awareness of history assists us all in our understanding for all communities in our country and around the world as people look to us. And I want to tell young people not to be afraid to be themselves, to know that they will thrive when they are themselves, and again say, as their Member of Parliament or an ally to them, we are here to be reached out and to listen to you. As we Conservatives believe, love is love. I'm proud to be standing up for women's rights, for all equal rights, and we can all do this positively in this place and elsewhere, and we can do it in the spirit that this debate has rightly been shown, and continue to do that because all our constituents need that. Thank you.
Minister, Neil Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and indeed thank you to all members today for such a constructive debate that we have had. I'd like to thank in particular the spokesperson for the opposition front bench for her excellent contributions, and she reminded us that the theme for this month's History Month is activism and social change. And she paid tribute as well to Alan Turing, as did some other members, and of course reminded us of the achievements of her party in government and mentioned the progress made there. And very, very helpfully, her full commitment to the ending of transmission of HIV infections by 2030, and we do welcome that cross-party support. Now, in terms of the relationship, sex and health education guidance that she particularly asked some questions about, look, the government is engaging with stakeholders, including parents, teachers and pupils, to discuss the draft RSHE and gender questioning in schools and college guidance, and drawing from available evidence, including the CAST review, to finalise the guidance. And I would just say we are taking the time to get this right and considering all available evidence alongside consultation responses before setting out the next steps. And it is absolutely good practice that schools and governing bodies should be sharing their SHE policies with parents. Indeed, I'll give way.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the Minister for an excellent roundtable yesterday, which she chaired through the Parliamentary Human Rights Group. And the absolute key message of that, where we heard from rights campaigners from East Africa as well as global organisations, was that we're in LGBT history right now when we're seeing the cuts to US government funding being forced out by really insidious transnational anti-rights campaigns. The call there for the UK to step in and fill in the gap from the US government was very clear. I hope the Minister will be taking that forward.
Minister. Well, absolutely. I mean, we have committed £40 million to those very aims indeed, and absolutely we will be stepping up to the mark, both in terms of our financial commitment, but also in terms of leadership from the UK on the international stage. We heard then from my honourable friend, the Chair of the Women Equalities Committee, and I thank her for her excellent work, and particularly for undertaking some very difficult discussions, and I will certainly refer the discussions and the evidence sessions that she has enabled on the puberty blockers issue to my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary. She too mentioned the proud Labour achievements that many other members mentioned, but also she wants to make sure, and I know she won't let there be any backslipping on this, that we absolutely keep to our manifesto commitments, and I can give her that assurance, and I can assure her in the same way as my colleague, the Minister for Women Equalities, did yesterday, that we are absolutely on track to be bringing forward a draft bill on conversion practices, delivering that fully trans-inclusive ban that will provide safety to LGBT plus people subject to those practices, and it will be in the form of a draft bill that will then have the opportunity to go through pre-legislative scrutiny. The spokesperson for the Lib Dems, the Honourable Member for Edinburgh West, she told us about the LGBT history in Scotland and the progress from a very hostile environment to a much more acceptable environment now. And she did remind us that in this recent toxic debate, especially in respect of trans people, it's very, very important that we stick together. This is an important fight for all of us, and something that we must take very, very seriously. And she particularly mentioned helping schools and businesses to tackle bullying, and I think that's something that you can never ever stop fighting. No matter how much you do, there's still a danger of backslipping on things like that, and we all need to be very much aware of that. My honourable friend for Jarrow and Gateshead East was very quick to remind us how proud she is of her diversity and the importance of activism to stop attitudes sliding backwards. I was sorry to hear of the unfortunate happenings after the Pride March in her hometown last year, and I very much hope that this year things will be much better. And I'm glad to hear that people are fighting back and facing down that hostility. Again, she mentioned the tackle and the increase in hate crime, especially transphobic hate, and the pride that she has in the fact that we are introducing the conversion practices ban and our HIV action plan. And she mentioned again the work she's doing with the Council of Europe, and I pay tribute to the huge efforts she has made on the Council of Europe and the work she's now doing on puberty blockers. My honourable friend for Edinburgh North and Leith told us of her activism, particularly in Unison, particularly in respect of equalising the age of consent and the impact of Section 2A in Scotland, the same as our Section 28 in England and Wales. And she mentioned her many successes, but said that the many successes of the campaigns, but that people are still living in fear and that there is still much to do, particularly internationally. The Honourable Member for Southend, West and Leigh mentioned some very difficult reflections of the early 80s and HIV fear and stigma, but talked about the progress we've made, the range of treatments, and of course reminded us that HIV is much wider than just the LGBT plus community, and how much he supports our HIV action plan. Again, he was worried about the rowing back on LGBT rights, the attacks on diversity, equality and inclusion, and we should all be embracing diversity, as he says. He is so right, in order to make the most of our talents, most good socially and the most good economically. And of course, we now have named the office in government taking care of these responsibilities as the Office of Equality and Opportunity. My honourable friend, the member for Nottingham East, talks about how far we've come, but there's still huge difficulties, especially for trans people, and she talked particularly of things like homelessness and suicide rates, and the way that trans people have been used as a political football. And she very clearly stated that as a woman, she sees no conflict between standing up for women's rights and standing up for trans people. And she quite rightly points out that attacking trans people are some of the very same sources that would then very happily attack women's rights. And so we should not think that there is a conflict between standing up for women and standing up for trans people. And she again made a very strong call for action, and a better world is possible. My honourable friend for Scarborough and Whitby made reference to the very sad story of her predecessor, Paul Latham. And again mentioned the historic achievements we have achieved since then. And I loved her description of her dog in its rainbow outfit. My honourable friend for Reading West and Mid-Berkshire told us about the power of Parliament in increasing LGBT plus rights, but also the power of LGBT plus ordinary people in living out their lives, confronting the shame that very often they had to face down and standing up and being visible. But again mentioned the fact we should never ever be complacent. And then my honourable friend for Ealing Southall contrasted the London she came to many years ago, I won't say how many, the Labour achievements since, but of course the slow down in progress and the worry about progress going forward, and the need absolutely to stand up for LGBT plus people. And she mentioned in particular, of course, the Employment Rights Bill, which does so much for rights of all our workers. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd just like to draw the House not just to the achievements of the past, the attention of the House, not just the achievements of the past, but also to the opportunities of the future. As I have said very clearly, we will publish draft legislation outlining a fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. We're committed to changing hate crime legislation to bring parity of protection for LGBT plus people, and we are determined to regain our place in the international arena as an example of progress, not decline. As history shows us, progress is not static, new challenges will always emerge, and hard-won rights must not only be cherished but guarded. That is why the Government is committed to upholding Britain's long-standing record of protecting the rights of individuals and ensuring the Equality Act protects everyone. But there are others who would gladly reverse this, returning us to a time when discrimination was permissible, even empowered under the law. We must be ever mindful of such intentions and remember from our history why we do not wish to revisit such times. Lawful discrimination, Section 28, vilification, and rejection by wider society are history, and they must remain such. Madam Deputy Speaker, whenever LGBT plus people have faced ingrained hostility or a rising tide of persecution and vilification, we have met it with bravery and resolve. We must remember these lessons and apply them to the times. Progress is not inevitable, it must be fought for, and that struggle continues, one in which we must all play our part to ensure that we move forward and never back.
The question is that this House has considered LGBT plus History Month. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes